Hello, this is Matt Pullen, and today I would like to discuss the King's Indian attack. But first, I would like to thank my first 100 subscribers. If it weren't for you guys, I probably wouldn't have made more than 3 or 4 of these videos. So this is the King's Indian attack. It's very easy to set up. It features the knight on f3, the fianchetto structure, d3, knight b to d2, and e4. This defines the King's Indian attack. White can play this against pretty much whatever black does, which explains its appeal at the club level. It's very easy for beginners to learn. But its greatest appeal is also its greatest weakness. It's a passive opening. Notice that nothing on black's half of the board is attacked more than once. Because of this, there's a wide variety of structures black can employ against this. For instance, if he gets to it out of a French, it might look something like this. This structure with the bishop on d6 and the knight g to e7 is sometimes called the Karpov Defense because that's what he employed against the King's Indian attack. You can also get to a Caro-Kann structure, which is based on the pawn on c6 and e5 as opposed to the other way around. You can also get to this with pawns on all 3 center squares. This is really just a King's Indian defense reversed. Finally, you can get to this out of a Sicilian defense. So there's a wide variety of choices black can play against the King's Indian attack, but I'm going to suggest a very aggressive one. Let's go into game mode. Let's flip the view. Edit game. Now, white can play pawn to e4 to try to get into the King's Indian attack. But for the sake of this video, let's just look at knight f3. Black plays pawn to d5, the best move against knight f3, and white plays g3, announcing his intention to fianchetto the king's bishop. Now, the move I'm going to recommend here is bishop to g4. This move is like a reverse Trompovsky, with white having a pawn on g3. And the threat is bishop takes f3 to double the white pawns. And because bishop to g2 is a natural move that white would play anyway, and it also meets the threat of bishop takes f3, you're going to see this move 90% of the time. So then, knight to c6, with the idea of playing pawn to e5. And if white castles, which is the next move in the King's Indian attack, and black plays pawn to e5, he's gained the center pawn duo of d5 and e5 without having to support it with any other pawns. e4 is already a threat, embarrassing the white knight. So white plays d3, again the next move in the King's Indian attack, and black plays queen to d7. The idea of this, it prepares queenside castling, and also bishop to h3, trading off, potentially, white's most dangerous piece. Now, knight b to d2, the next move in the King's Indian attack, and pawn to f6. Now what we have is a reverse Pirtz defense. The Pirtz is usually reached e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6. And what we have here is a reverse color version of something called the 130 attack, where the idea is to castle queenside, trade off the bishops by playing bishop h3 and bishop takes g2, and then pushing the g and h pawns in order to checkmate the white king. So let's just look at what happens after rook to e1, the next move in the King's Indian attack, and black will play bishop to h3, and now if white preserves the bishop with bishop to h1, he's doing this at a high cost because he's blocking his h-pawn. So after knight to h6, with the idea of dropping back to f7, and pushing the g and h pawns, g5, h5, h4, etc., opening lines around the white king, it's a very dangerous attack. And however white tries to open the center, black will just block the center. So this is a version of the 130 attack, and it's a very dangerous attack for white to deal with, probably not what he wants to play if he's playing the King's Indian attack. So, how do you prevent this reverse Pirtz defense? Well, stop black from playing e5. A lot of the time, white plays pawn to d4. It's not really a King's Indian attack anymore, but the idea is by turning it into a queen-pawn game, he's hoping to take advantage of the fact that there is a knight on c6. Because the knight usually does not belong in front of the c-pawn because the c-pawn wants to advance to fight for control of the center. So in this position, I suggest playing f6 here. The idea is play e5 by any means necessary. f6 is not a developing move, but it does control a lot of center squares. So let's say what white can do. He can play bishop to f4, but as it turns out, this does not prevent e5. So black plays e5, and white captures, and then black captures the knight. Bishop takes, f takes. Now this bishop is threatened, and the best square it has available is c1. And now knight to f6 because the d5 pawn was hanging. And in this position, black has the center pawn duo, pawns on e5 and d5, supported by two knights on their best squares. Meanwhile, white has a bishop pair to black's bishop and knight, and no serious weaknesses. For instance, if bishop to g5, threatening to win a pawn on d5, then black can advance and force the bishop to go back to its hole, and then play bishop to e7, followed by castling kingside and kicking this bishop on g5. Again, you have two bishops versus space. It's a very unclear position. So let's go back. That's what happens if bishop f4. Black can play e5. What about c4? Trying to undermine black in the center because his c-pawn is not available to reinforce the pawn. Well, e5 can be played, and this gets really wild, because if pawn takes pawn, then black can play bishop takes knight. After bishop takes, knight takes, bishop g2, bishop to c5. Black can get a very reasonable game based on blockading this pawn on d5. If he's able to keep this blockade square on d6, and the pawn on d5 stays here, the bishop on g2 will be very limited. And if the other pawn capture, black can play d4. And this reaches something called the Albin counter gambit. The Albin counter gambit is usually reached d4, d5, c4, e5, and it was the subject of another one of my popular videos, the Lasker's Trap video. And this version, white has to accept the gambit because black is threatening f takes e5. So pawn takes, knight takes. And now the idea here is that black has very easy development. He'll play bishop to c5, castles kingside, queen to d7, move his rooks to the center, and play bishop to h3 to trade off the white bishop on g2. Meanwhile, white's most elegant developing moves, such as knight to c3, are inhibited by the pawn on d4. But white is up a pawn, so all of this is positional compensation for the pawn that black is down. Again, the Albin counter gambit, a very technical opening, difficult to play. It's probably not what a King's Indian attack player is looking for either. Again, I'm stereotyping. Most people play the King's Indian attack because they want easy positions to play. So let's see what happens if c4. The move c4, I do not recommend this because there's a strong attack on the queen side after b4. This pawn cannot be taken because of queen a4 and knight to e5. But instead, I recommend pawn takes pawn, and queen to a4 to recover the pawn is met by queen to d7. Otherwise, knight to e5 was a strong threat. So queen to d7, queen takes pawn, and then black achieves his dream of playing his pawn to e5 in the center, and black is at least equalized here. So those are some possibilities in this my anti-King's Indian attack, which is defined by bishop to g4 combined with knight to c6. I hope this gave you some interesting ideas to face the King's Indian attack in the future. Good luck!